You're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Derby. David Normoyle joins us today to delve into golf history and heritage and the attendant importance of these two elements for golf clubs in general. He currently consults and advises an array of private members' clubs on their respective histories and the preservation and presentation of their unique stories. Prior to founding his own consulting practice, David was engaged as Assistant Director of the USGA Museum. His former colleague, Dr. Rand Jerris, has been quoted as follows: "David has the attributes you'd want in a good historian. The ability to ask the right questions, the willingness to dig deeply to find the right information, the agility to switch thinking when research turns up the unexpected, and the ability to synthesize a lot of information into meaningful learnings. Importantly, he also has the people skills, and that can be rare in an academic. When you're with him, David has a way of making you feel like you are the most important person in the world, and maybe even the only person in the world. He is 100% present and 100% connected." I'm very pleased to welcome David Normoyle to the podcast today. We really do hope you enjoy our chat. Good to go?
Good to go.
David Normoyle, you're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much, Shane. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time. As you know, I planned to ask you how your winter golf has been. However, I understand it's not really amounted to very much due to work and travel and maybe more latterly some cold weather. Presumably Saratoga Springs, New York in the winter generally does not present many golfing opportunities for you.
Well, I keep trying to learn that good rest is a necessary part of good work. I'm not sure how well I'm doing with that, but here we are.
Excellent. Well, listen, maybe if we can get cracking with a first peep into the fascinating world of golf heritage and history. For starters, you might provide us with a little introduction to how history, heritage, culture, and perhaps ethos interact with respect to golf clubs.
It's a big question, but I'll see what I can do. Reflecting on the question earlier in my career, when I first started out at the USGA's museum, I used to get phone calls all the time from clubs who had an archive that was a mess, or they were about to celebrate a centennial, or they were redoing the clubhouse prior to hosting the U.S. Open. And it became clear to me that they had a need. They had a problem that they were trying to solve, but they didn't know how to go about doing it. So, and even years before that, earlier in my USGA days, I had proposed an idea that the USGA could provide a service to clubs, kind of like turfgrass advisory or rules education on how to preserve a club's history. And while that never came to pass while I was there, when I left the USGA to get married and moved to Saratoga Springs, it provided me with an opportunity to try that idea on for size myself. And I quickly realized in talking with clubs and club boards that they were often made up of business people who they had an understanding how to manage assets of various kinds, whether they were personally interested in those assets or not. But when it came to their own club's history, I found that unless they had a personal interest, they tended to see no real value in that history. And that's when I realized I needed to change the conversation into a language that they understood better. And my insight was the idea that every club, no matter how famous they may be or how humble they may be, they have the same four basic assets. Everybody's got a golf course. Everybody's got a clubhouse. Everybody has a membership. And then fourth, everybody has a heritage. And when you think about how to manage those assets, the members, they don't mow the greens. The superintendent does. The members don't run the clubhouse. The general manager does. The members don't teach each other lessons and run tournaments, and they definitely shouldn't teach each other lessons. That would be a terrible idea. But a golf professional does. And so the point is all of these key assets for every club, they're managed by specially trained people. happen to be professionals. And so when it comes to a club's heritage, if you don't put the same rigor into its care as the chorus or the clubhouse, how do you expect to have an outcome equal to your high expectations for those things? And my job has been to help a club learn how to manage its heritage to the same standard that it expects of its other assets. And that's what the most respected clubs do. All their assets are presented at the same high standard.
Well, I think you're verging into some of the presentation that you did at the Heritage Conference that the RNA and the British Golf Collectors Society held last year in St Andrews. It probably won't surprise you too much that I use your presentation deck as part inspiration in planning our chat today. In your opening remarks at St Andrews, you said that history doesn't magically perpetuate itself. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think to put it in less golfy, but more universal human terms, if you remember the stories that your grandmother or your grandfather told you, and you receive them, but you don't then tell those stories to future generations, what happens to those stories? You'll still have a family, but it's not one that's connected to this ongoing story. That's not in itself a good thing or a bad thing. It just is, but it means that you're no longer having that connection. And so that connection, if it's valuable to you, well, you keep telling the story. And the same is true with clubs. That's how they don't magically perpetuate themselves unless you keep telling the story again and again.
So some clubs have a tendency perhaps to treat history passively, maybe a box of sepia tinge photographs in the attic or a hickory club or two mounted on the wall. Do you think, other than losing the stories or the connection with those stories, are there any other potential long-term dangers lurking in the shadows for clubs who adopt a passive approach to their history?
Well, sure. And I think really the important thing to remember is that unless how that history is presented maintains some ongoing relevance to the current generation, just like your grandfather's story, it will vanish. And the danger of that vanishing, I think, is that each new generation becomes forced to redefine the club's story for itself. And again, that's not a good thing or a bad thing. And in a lot of ways, every generation redefining things is the most natural way of things, but it is hugely resource intensive. So think about just how much time is wasted in businesses redefining their mission every few years. I mean, wouldn't it be more efficient to actually just know your mission and focus energy on executing it rather than just sitting around the table and redefining it all the time? Because by definition,
Yeah,
if we think about it, a club is nothing more than a group of like-minded people. So in a way, what you're like-minded about could be wine or quilting or airplanes or stamps, golf, whatever. How you go about caring for such things is actually the single most important thing a club should be focused on, even more than its golf course or clubhouse or the people who happen to temporarily occupy the membership. Being like-minded is the thing that unifies a club.
I'm minded to just hark back to a quotation that Philip Truitt, a mutual acquaintance of both of us, I believe, uses at the bottom of his emails. And he says, history is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of the fire. That's really, I suppose, what you're talking about in a nutshell.
Like-minded in every way. And it's a Gustav Mahler quote. So one of the great conductors and composers.
I did not know that. So he's got it from Mr. Mahler. Listen, in the course of your daily professional life, you consult with golf clubs, focusing specifically on the history and heritage therein. We're a historical club to say to you that reconnecting or uncovering or reimagining its history and heritage was not a strategic consideration. What would you say to them?
Well, I think I just laid out a case for the fact that these are your assets, whether you care about them or not. And if they don't find that a compelling asset, or if they don't find that a compelling argument, then I'm probably not the right person to help them.
You also alluded to a concept which I think you called active conservation, where club histories are cared for, conserved and passed on. To your mind, what does this active conservation look like for a Greens convener or a council chairperson on a random Tuesday morning?
Well, you really can't do this without active engagement. A lot of people say they like tradition. It's an easy thing to say. And then you ask them what their favorite definition is or how they would define tradition, and you don't get very far in a lot of cases. Um, and so, to offer a suggestion, my favorite definition of tradition is an invention that was so good we decided to keep doing it. And I think what that means is that unless you're aware of what your inventions were and why you kept doing them, how can you really be a good steward of your club's future actions today? Because otherwise, you're just reinventing it on your terms. This might be a little wonky so early in the conversation, but it does bring to mind a favorite quote. I like quotes; they're fun. Darwin liked quotes. He was the editor of Bartlett's of the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations. So I suppose keeping good company. But it's from a Yale professor named Yaroslav Pelikan, who wrote a book called The Vindication of Tradition. And he said, this is in the early mid 1980s, he said, tradition is the living faith of the dead, whereas traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Say it again. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. What this means, Pelikan said, is that tradition lives in conversation with the past while remembering where we are and when we are, and that it is we who have to decide, just like those before us had to decide. Traditionalism supposes that nothing should ever be done for the first time. So if you think about it, the companion to the extremes on the spectrum of all of this, the companion to the extremes of traditionalism, which would be never doing anything new, is also making it up as you go along without having any conversation with the past. Both are they're more similar to one another than not. Being in conversation with the past requires effort and it requires humility. Not everyone wants to give the former and not everyone has the latter. So too often what we see is either some sort of reactionary traditionalism, never do anything, or ignorant self-interest, which is do whatever you want. Neither are particularly desirable qualities, especially in a traditional organization.
So if we look at this curation, it implies iterations, a longer term view on things, but it also implies some form of editing. I'm just wondering how clubs avoid the trap of thinking everything old is important, and how would you distinguish between tradition and habit? I mean, just doing things because we always have.
Well, first of all, everyone needs an editor, especially me. I think this is a universal truth in all of life. But the way I like to think about it is, again, to put it in familiar non-golf terms, think about it like a chef in a restaurant. If the chef, when you go out to have a meal, presented you with a list of all of the ingredients in the pantry, including all the spices, how would you know what to eat? You'd be overwhelmed. You wouldn't. But instead, the chef presents those ingredients into organized recipes and dishes presented on a menu in an understandable way. And in a lot of ways, history is no different to this. It requires discernment and it requires presentation on behalf of those who are trying to share the information. So how do you prioritize? One of the ways that I think about doing this is by prioritizing or classifying these stories that you want to tell into a couple of different categories, which are, understandable and instinctive to most people. What are the stories you must know, without which you'd be doing a bad job? What are the stories you should know? And then what are the stories you will come to know over the course of time? This is going to be different for everyone, but everyone seems to know the difference between a must-know story and a should-know story. And so you have to do the work on the front end for people so that they can then engage, kind of like the chef with the menu.
Interesting. I guess that idea kind of plays into, we often hear less is more in terms of golf course design and indeed golf course presentation, be it tree removal or adjustment of mowing lines, simplifying and decluttering the on-course visual aesthetic and experience. How does the less is more mantra apply to a club's culture and history?
Well, one of the things, Shane, that I've learned in observing these different places is that clubs are all different, but yet the great ones have certain things in common. And what I think the universally admired clubs have that distinguishes themselves as others is that They know what they care about, and they devote the necessary resources to those things. And equally, they know what they don't care about, and they resist the temptation to throw good money at bad ideas. Mediocre clubs tend to be the opposite. They starve their most important priorities of the resources that made them good in the first place, and then they spend all sorts of money on really not very good ideas that make no sense in hopes of reviving their spirits. And I think in a lot of ways, this is addressed by a great philosophy by C.S. Lewis, who talked about originality. And he said, you'll never make a good impression on other people until you stop worrying about what sort of impression you're making. Even in literature and art, no man who bothers about originality will ever be original, whereas you simply try to tell the truth without caring how often it's been told before, you will 9 times out of 10 become original without ever having noticed it. This principle runs through all of life from top to bottom. So just tell the truth.
And I guess sometimes that means maybe not presenting warts and all, but understanding what those warts through time were, and that perhaps gives a fuller appreciation of where you've come from and where you've ended up.
I think that's right. I mean, the warts and all question is fundamentally a philosophical one, which is, how do you inspire people? Do you inspire them by painting a picture of reality precisely as it is, however bleak or joyful that might be? Or do you focus on elevating the human condition by telling stories of us at our best? I mean, I think the answer we all know is both, but it requires discernment on the part of the storyteller to know which story to tell to which audience at what point in time.
And in terms of those stories, David, many clubs have their own myths. These can range from visits of former greats, boundary and property issues, or indeed a back catalogue of consulting architects who may or may not have provided advice or design input. As a historian, you obviously have to verify facts. But do you think there's a value to these myths? In other words, how do you balance the truth with the legend?
Well, I think the role of heritage is to do 2 really important things. One is it helps get people who are outside your door to be curious about who you are and want to walk through your door. And myths, I think, have a way in that. But second, and perhaps more importantly, is once people walk through your door, do they look around and do they want to stay out of loyalty? And if all it is myth, that loyalty evaporates very quickly. And that's where the truth comes in, is it keeps people in the house. And I think you can't really control the stories that you tell outside your house, but you sure can within your own walls.
So do you think that a club can have a strong culture without knowing where it came from, going back to that iteration? So understanding both the positive and the negative chapters. It strikes me as that understanding where you're going very much needs to be driven by, to a certain degree, where you come from.
I think that's true. And we live in a culture of the recent and immediate being the most powerful thing. The most recent posted tweet or video or whatever has more power than something from 200 years ago. But most cultures, or many cultures throughout history, have had it the other way around, which is they trusted the old and they had a mistrust for the present. And I wonder which had it better in some ways.
So in terms of culture, history obviously undoubtedly informs culture, but do you think culture can also at times distort history?
Of course. I mean, it's a constant ongoing conversation that never ends. And that's what makes it fun and interesting. I quoted George Orwell, and I've done it more than once, that who controls the past controls the present, and who controls the present controls the past. This is from 1984, and it sounds ominous, but I think it's true. Nothing is ever settled.
So if you walked into a club today that felt soulless, generic, corporate, perhaps uninspired, where would you look in their history to find the spark to reignite that culture? And I'm just wondering if you've sort of, through experience, if you think that culture is always hiding somewhere in the archives.
Well, every family has a story. if you think about it. And one of the influential things that brought props for you is a book called Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander from 1977. It's a 1,200-page reference book that just about every architecture student gets assigned to read, and it lists 253 patterns that define life in the built environment. And interestingly, the last and final pattern, number 253 out of 253, is called Things from Your Life. And he writes, decor and the conception of interior design have spread so widely that very often people forget their instinct for the things they really want to keep around them. Do not be tricked into believing that modern decor must be anything that current tastemakers claim. It is most beautiful when it comes straight from your life, the things you care for, the things that tell your story. This is true in our homes. This is true in our clubs. This is true in places we love. If it's somebody's idea of a beautiful design, that's fine for a period of time, but that's not something you live in. You live in the stories of your lives.
It strikes me, the clubs, the best examples that you spoke about, those willing to be original, that have strategically engaged and understood their history. It allows them, I think, to exude a quiet confidence and, dare I say it, certainty. They seem to understand the role as standard bearers. Perhaps they were key to the beginnings of golf in certain parts of the world. They ultimately understand that they're descended from those early pioneers who drove the game forward, and they continue to lead, conscious of the past yet confident of their future direction and travel. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
You can always build something new, but you can't build something old. And for some people, they will always want the new, which is okay. But the value of the old is there is an unbroken connection to that kind of story. And for the people who covet those kinds of places and crave them, I think it's really important they continue to exist and thrive.
We're going to take a brief tangential direction to our discussion, and this part of our chat is inspired by a relatively recent New Year's trip to Sillet-on-Solway in northwest Cumbria. A very cold but enjoyable few days were experienced where I played a few rounds around a frosty and frozen Sillet. As you can imagine, that experience brought completely new meaning to firm and fast. Sillet very much reminded me of places like Rye and Royal Worlington, cathedrals of the game where members and visitors can enjoy golf on firm turf, presented perfectly for golf, routed across terrain that is both beguiling and confounding. What lessons pertaining to the past might be available to lucky golfers that get to visit golfing time capsules such as Sillet, Rye or Mildenhall, do you think?
I haven't been to Sillet, but everyone I know says I'd love it. So I can't wait for the day that happens.
I think you would.
I do love Rye and Worlington, and I count among my treasures being a member at both clubs. They're wonderful treasures in my life. But to your specific question, I think the answer is to just soak it all in. What these great places have with age is they have texture. And being an observer of all of the little details that couldn't be invented in the first go-around, they are the details that make these places so rich, and they'll only enhance your experience. And the better observer you become of the details, I think the better that you can see. To the larger question about fast and firm conditions and the experience of playing the game in that format, I think the great five-time Open champion Peter Thompson really gets it right here when he talks about how he sees golf as a game that exists in 3 dimensions. And the way that those 3 dimensions are number 1, how far you hit the ball. Number 2, how straight or in what direction you hit the ball. And then thirdly, what happens to the ball when it hits the ground. So standing on a driving range is really only about one thing, right? It's about how far you hit it or in what direction you hit it. And that's it. Ultimately, that's not particularly interesting in the long run, though it can be fun, kind of like junk food in the short run. Many golf courses test some combination of how far you hit it and in what direction, and I think that's good. and is interesting, but it's only two-dimensional in the end. Truly great golf, in Thompson's mind, and I think in all of ours, only happens when you also have to determine what happens to the ball when it's on the ground. That's where a true skill expresses itself. That's the third dimension of the game. It's easy, and I think it can be slightly lazy to bash places like Augusta National for their conditioning and the effect that they have on other courses with smaller budgets. But actually, if we twist that and we think about it in an upside down way, what are the greatest and most memorable shots in Masters history? They're shots like Ben Crenshaw or Jack Nicklaus's long rolling putts in 1984 and 1975. Tiger's chip on 16 in 2005. Even Greg Norman's shot rolling off the front of the ninth green in 1996, but for the wrong reasons, not for a great shot, but for one that made him sink to his knees. The point is, golf is at its best when the outcome of a shot is in doubt for as long as possible. Every full shot, whether it's a wedge or a driver, is in the air for the same amount of time, about 7 seconds. But not every shot is rolling on the ground for the same amount of time. And that's where I think conditioning and architecture is so important, that it's integrated, because getting the ball to roll on the ground for as long as possible is what makes the game great to play and great to watch. It's that combination of good architecture and great conditioning that allows that to happen. And I think firm and fast is one way to get there, and maybe the best way to get there, but it's not the only way. The key is to present conditions and architecture that bring out the third dimension of the game, which is to make sure the ball rolls when it's on the ground.
And I think as a golfing community, we're getting better in understanding that.
I think that's true. One of the best insights I ever got on this was from Rusty Mercer, who was a superintendent at Streamsong in Florida. And he said that there's two kinds of superintendents. There's those who grow grass and those who provide playing conditions. And you can't do both. You have to pick one or the other. So are you a club that provides playing conditions, or are you a club that grows green grass? You have to figure that out. You can control that, but you have to make that decision.
As Mike Clayton is wont to say, there's a difference between perfect turf and turf perfect for golf.
Bingo. Same idea, said differently.
Yeah. We mentioned Rye and Royal Worlington there. That provides me with a nice opportunity to cajole our discussion towards playing formats and pace of play. As we examine golf's journey through history, it is clear that increasing amounts of time are required, unfortunately, to complete an 18-hole round. Harry Varden once suggested, don't play too much golf. 2 rounds per day are plenty. This sort of comment seems to suggest a brisk rhythm or cadence required. How might we go about re-educating golfers to the value and joy of a sub-3-hour round? And whispering this very quietly, perhaps the merest suggestion of an occasional spot of forcemas thrown in just to mix up the interminable humdrum nature of Stableford and medal strokes.
Well, I mean, you're preaching to the choir here. Huge fan of foursomes, but I think in answer to the seriousness of the question, which is how do we get people to pay attention to this, let's start with what already exists. So Rule 5.6 says, a round of golf is meant to be played at a prompt pace. Say it again. A round of golf is meant to be played at a prompt pace.
Are you saying that people that play slowly are in fact breaking the rules?
You can feel free to agree with that or not. If not, you're playing something other than golf, right? Prompt, which is a very good word. And actually what I like about prompt is it's one of the rich words in the English language that survived the recent rules changes. Hazard is also a rich word that didn't survive the rules changes, but that's for another topic and another discussion. But prompt is a word that I think at its core is an expression of respect for other people's time. It's respect for your free time, which is limited. It's respect for the time of your companions, the people watching you, if you're a professional. But I think the idea here in all of this, Shane, is that playing golf well is a skill, but playing well while playing promptly is not only a tradition of the game, it's the central lesson of a game without a clock. Why would we give that up to gain a few more yards on a scorecard or indulge a professional who's worried about a single stroke?
Yeah, yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. Um, you straddled the Atlantic, operating both in the US and the UK. I'm just wondering, do you see any differences in how the governing bodies view history and heritage?
Well, it depends on the decade because they certainly had different approaches at different times throughout the years. But I think today the USJ and the RNA are as unified on all of these topics as they've ever been, and I think at the moment they have no equal among any other organization in the game. Nobody's investing in heritage like the USJ and the RNA are through their museums, storytelling, all of which is available to the public. It's available online with amazing research and reference resources, um, through exhibits, displays. Uh, to me, it's amazing what the USJ and the RNA does. And as everybody else in the game is running as fast as they can in the opposite direction, the USJ and the RNA are standing up for these things. That may come back to bite us in the future when we think about the growth of these new audiences that have come to the game in recent years. We'll see how that plays out, but for obvious reasons, I'm on the side of history, and it's not particularly controversial to say this, but the USGA and the RNA are doing it better than anybody else.
If we look at the distance debate as a history lesson for a moment, I understand that the USGA and the RNA are currently reviewing the implementation timeline for the rollback of the golf ball. Obviously, this amendment to testing criteria was originally scheduled to begin in 2028 for professional golfers. However, the ruling bodies are now considering pushing the entire universal rollout to 2030 to avoid what they call a bifurcated system. In light of this recent news, I'm conscious that the distance rollback is often pitched as a technical or commercial debate. However, if we transport ourselves back some 126 years to the days of the great John Lowe and the beginning of this conversation, he stated quite sensibly that the ball should be designed to fit the golf courses, not the courses to fit the ball. So, isn't this really a historical debate that has somehow been hijacked to a certain degree by commercial forces? And I'm just wondering why you think this historical argument has tended to fall on deaf ears.
Well, sometimes if people don't have ears to hear or eyes to see, there's nothing that you can do about that. However, there is an insight here which I think is helpful, and it comes from a 1955 book called A History of Golf by Robert Browning, and he talked about this very subject, and he framed it as in these terms. He said, as time went on, the ingenuity of the manufacturers produced a missile capable of being propelled over ever increasing distances. The only result was to give golfers more and more walking for fewer shots. So think about that for a second. If we were inventing golf today, would you be promoting a game that requires more walking for less hitting? It's the very opposite of every other sport in the world, and indeed golf, trying to get people involved. Why would you want to walk more to hit less? Yet that's the logical consequence of increases in distance. So thinking of it in another way, fitting the ball to the stadium instead of the stadium to the ball, a Ferrari is an amazing human invention. It's something that can do 200 miles an hour and look astonishing while doing so. Pair that with 17-mile drive, Pebble Beach, California, one of the most beautiful and awe-inspiring roads on the planet. What would happen if Pebble Beach said it was going to reroute 17-mile drive to accommodate a Ferrari performing at 200 miles an hour? It would obliterate the very reason for going there in the first place, which is the pace and the beauty of the setting. And I think that that's true in golf, too. And sooner or later, every golfer has to learn a few things in his or her education. The first is the only person who cares about your golf is you. So that's number one. So moving beyond that, more importantly, it's the idea that distance is relative. Only time is absolute. And respecting people's time and being respectful of the beauty of the land is the most valuable thing golf can represent. So seeing golfers or organizations throwing a temper tantrum because their golf ball can't go 10 yards farther seems to me completely contrary to that spirit. Um, the lesson is distance is relative, and nobody wants more walking for less hitting if they actually think about it. But the problem is they don't think about it.
So as we near the end of our time together, David, it would be remiss of me not to touch upon the important influence that golf literature and club libraries can play in passing on the traditions and heritage of golf. The sports writer George Plimpton once suggested that the smaller the ball, the better the writing. Would you agree with this contention?
It's a great quote, and I would say at an earlier point in my own golfing journey, I would have, and I did frequently cite this quote to prove the point. But I think as I reflect on it now, that really was more about me wanting to justify the job I had chosen and why I cared about it, rather than whether it's actually true. I think they're great writers in all sports, but golf does have the advantage of possessing some unique elements, the variety of playing fields, the styles of the player, nuances about equipment, instruction, turf grass, architecture, collectibles, um, anything really. And what I love about golf is that there are all sorts of shelves that you and your own particular interest can sit on and be the best in the world at what you do, whether you play it or not. And it makes for, I think, a truly inexhaustible subject.
I note that the custodians at West Lancashire Golf Club have recently opened a new club library as a direct result of their attendance at last year's Heritage Conferences at St Andrews. I'm just wondering what advice you would proffer to any golf clubs out there that are considering a similar development project.
Well, no greater encouragement could be given to what we did with the RNA Heritage Conference than to hear that news. I remember reading the article about it in Through the Green, and I thought, this is great. Uh,
Result.
So more, please. But what I would say in reflection on all that, and I'm not meaning to pick on anybody here, but it may sound like I am. How many golf clubs have professionals, or even a staff full of them? Most, right? How much does that cost every year? I'm not saying it's not valuable, but it's a significant investment annually. Does every single member take a lesson from those professionals? And if not, does that mean you shouldn't have professionals available to those who want to be better at the game? That seems like a fundamental thing that golf clubs do, whether everybody takes advantage of them or not. And I think I view golf libraries the same way, encouraging people to read more books and stop scrolling on their phones. It can only be a good thing. And when you think about the cost of creating a library compared to the staff of golf professionals every year, that cost is pretty minimal and long lasting.
Any discussion with you would feel half-arsed if I neglected to mention the great Bernard Darwin, someone whose life, times and writings I know you've studied closely over the years. Indeed, I think the first line of your master's thesis begins as follows. Bernard Darwin was to golf what Samuel Johnson was to the English language. So I suppose the word monumental might not be out of place for either gentleman. You might discuss.
Well, I think that's right. We can't understand writing about the game or indeed its development in the 20th century without understanding Darwin's role and influence on that, not just as a writer, but as a golfer, as an administrator, as somebody who was deeply involved in the game. But I think the word connection is really the most important word that we can draw our attention to when we're describing Bernard Darwin, because it was his method of writing connected readers to references to literature, to art, and to ideas having nothing to do with golf at a time before radio, before television. In a way, by having how he described what was occurring on a golf course layered with all of these allusions and connections, he helped people understand the subtleties and the big ideas of this bizarre game in a way better than anybody else before or since. And I think what Darwin understood is that golf is both part of life and yet stands apart from life. And he made the connection between the two better than anyone I've read.
So most listeners will probably know that Darwin was the golf correspondent for both the London Times and country life for the best part of 50 years, passing away at the age of 85 in 1961. Obviously, so long ago since he passed, but his writing feels timeless. Do you think that reading some of his back catalogue can allow us to foster a deeper connection with the game of golf in perhaps a more meaningful way?
It can't hurt, so why not try it? I'm not sure everyone would agree because some of his writing could be a bit dense or abstract to our modern ears, but he was a man of his Victorian and Edwardian times. He was educated in classical literature at Eton and Cambridge, so it's not a surprise that the old ideas persist in his writing.
And do you think, just in a more general terms, that reading about the history of the game of golf can change how us readers may choose to play the game or how to approach it? I mean, perhaps if a golfer reads about the architecture of the golden age or the ethos of those early match play days, do you think it might change how they view a bad bounce or perhaps appreciate or otherwise a difficult lie?
Well, for some people, yes. For other people, no. I think that's okay. I'm just glad the Library of Golf exists for those who are curious. But to me, the big idea in all of this, Shane, is trying to understand that actually, if you move beyond the idea that you didn't invent golf, and that the most important thing about our game is not your game, that each of us is part of a big long story, and it's fun to see how we fit into all of that. Why wouldn't you want that to enrich your experience in this game instead of just buying the latest thing or some new swing tip? Those are important things, but I don't think they are as deep or satisfying as some of the others.
Listen, we're going to change things up a little for our last couple of questions
Sure.
today. The first of which will allow you to pick three figures from golf history to join you for a round. Who are they? Where are you playing? And what's your preferred format of play?
Okay. For personal reasons, and I suppose because I've written about them, but I didn't really know them personally. I've met one of them, but didn't meet the other two because they were before my time. It would be Bernard Darwin, as we've spoken about, Bobby Jones, and Arnold Palmer. None of those are particularly original or unique to me or to anybody, but they've been important people in my own personal life and development as a golfer. And I just think they would be the most fun people to be around because they lived the game. They shaped how we think about it. They excelled at playing it from the 1880s with, gutta percha balls all the way up to the modern ball and steel shafts and titanium drivers. They spread the whole history of the game. And I think their combined perspectives would be unparalleled to anybody else. They hand off from one to the next, Darwin to Jones to Palmer. And the place that we would do it would have to be the library at National Golf Links of America. And our host would be Charles Blair Macdonald because he straddled the British and American aspects of golf more profoundly than anyone else who's ever lived. So the setting is the National Golf Links Library. Our host is Charles Blair Macdonald, and we've got Darwin, Jones, and Palmer. And I think it would be fun.
That sounds fantastic. If every golfer listening could read two books to understand some of the background of golf heritage that we've discussed today, which books would you recommend for them to dip into? And why do you think that the particular recommendations you're going to make are important?
Well, every golf book or golf reading or any book reading experience is intensely personal to you. So I have to express that as a caveat first. But I would say number one would be connected with somebody who we just talked about, Charles Blair Macdonald. It would be his book, Scotland's Gift, Golf, because it gets us from golf in St. Andrews in the 1870s up through the 1920s, the formation of the USGA, the creation of golf architecture, is foundational to our understanding of how people discovered the game in the UK and then took it around the world. So that's a starting point. And then the second, again, important for me personally, would be by Herbert Warren Wind, his collection of essays from 1985 called Following Through, which gets us from Bobby Jones and Gene Sarazen up through Jack Nicklaus and Tom Watson, I think Wind was as good as anybody about talking about the great places and traditions of the game. He really was Darwin's successor in American golf literature, and I think he's a reminder that we need to go back to golf's roots to gain an education in what it means to our lives today. And I know for me personally, had I not read that book, I would have never thought about this entirely different world of the President's Putter and the Oxford and Cambridge Golfing Society and everything that's possible through all of that. So to Herb Wind and Charles Blair Macdonald, I owe a great debt in my own personal story in the game.
Perhaps one final thought before we let you go, David. If you could leave our listeners with one actionable piece of advice to start to better care for their club's histories if they're not already doing that, what would it be?
Easiest, simplest, and least expensive way to do about it is start a daily eBay or auction search for your home club. You never know what will turn up. I can think of one project that I was working on where an eBay search popped up. Somebody in the early 1930s had taken their family on a road trip in the American West and used a tiny little camera and took snapshots and pasted them into a photo album. And one of the pages of this photo album was on eBay, and I went and bought it, and I gave it to the superintendent, and it showed a picture of a particular bunker that they had an aerial view of, but they never had a ground view of this bunker, and they didn't know how to restore it. I gave him the photo. He said, "Oh, we could do that." And the next week, the bunker was restored. So get on eBay, find a search, make it daily. You never know what'll turn up. I would say that's totally actionable and free. And the other thing is, if you're really curious, join the Golf Heritage Society or join the British Golf Collectors Society, because it will open up a fascinating world of knowledgeable people and two of the best golf publications going. And for that alone, it's worth it.
David Normoyle, it's been my great pleasure to welcome you to the show today. Many thanks for taking the time to chat with me. Continued success to you in assisting golf clubs in augmenting their stories and presentation of same. Go easy, my friend.
Thank you, Shane.
Many thanks for tuning in. If you don't currently follow us on socials, you can do so as follows. On X, you can find us at Firm and Fast Golf. On Instagram, Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. On Blue Sky, if you're that way inclined, the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. On YouTube at the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. And indeed finally on Substack at the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast occasional newsletter. We favour to ask, if you're still with us, if you're enjoying the show, you might consider giving us a star rating or a review on your podcast platform of choice. It really would be appreciated. Thanks again for listening.